Section 26 of The Lion's Brood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shashank Jakhmola. The Lion's Brood by Duffield OSBORNE. The Slave. It was an hour past midnight when Marcia first knew the agony of returning reason. The gong in the forum had just struck. Where was she? Surely in her own apartment. How had she come there? Then, slowly, the memory of yesterday grew clear. The awful duty of tomorrow. With eyelids fast shut, as if dreading to open them to the darkness, she buried her throbbing temples beneath the rich companion coverlid. She could still see the eyes of Idilker gleaming wolfish amid his jewels. She could see him standing in the doorway as he turned from that startled rush in pursuit of what had been, doubtless, only a whisper of their imaginations. He had said he would come for her before daybreak, and she must be ready. Later she could approach death with suppliant hands, but now she must be ready. Her life was not her own yet, it was her country's. Later the shade of Lucius would beckon. Surely he would forgive her for having avenged him. But how had she reached her room? Had it been Calvius or the slaves who had found her? Did they suspect? Then she remembered the man who had seemed to catch her as she fell. Where could Idilkar have been then? Had he hurried away? Probably enough. Again a slight scratching noise, as of someone softly changing his position, like the sound which had startled the priest, came to her ears. Ah, protecting gods! What was true, and what but dreams? Her whole life was passing before her, phantasmagorial and unreal. Surely someone was present. She felt it. Had Idilkar come already? The horror of the thought gave her courage, and, thrusting down the coverlid, she opened her eyes defiantly and tried to pierce the darkness. Nothing was visible, but she knew she was not alone, and leaning upon one elbow, she reached out, groping. Suddenly a hand grasped hers, a strong, bony hand, gripping it tightly and by its very energy commanding silence. It seemed strange to her that she did not scream, but then she had known that she would find someone, and had the hand been Idilkar's, she would certainly have realized it by the loathing in her soul. For her, now, all other men had become friends. Therefore she was not frightened, did not cry out. Rather, it was a soothing sense of companionship that came to her, almost of reliance. Why had this man come? Perhaps to help her, surely not to injure. Who was he? Man or God? Gods had appeared to those of olden times, when the Republic was young and Romans worshipped, believing. She felt very brave, fearless. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am a slave," answered a voice. "I brought you here, and I am watching." It was a voice that, while it rang hard, yet had in it an assurance of protection, even of power, and it thrilled her as with some familiar memory. Nevertheless, she could not place its owner in the household. Calvius had many slaves. A few of them had been free-born, and some, perhaps, might even have known a measure of social standing before the turn of war or of financial fortunes had lost them to home and position. "Who are you?" she asked again. "I am a new servant," said the other. "Pacuvius Calvius bought me yesterday in the street of the whitened feet." She was silent a moment, trying hard to think. She felt the man's hand trembling, and then, suddenly realizing, she drew her own away. "And yet you are going tomorrow with this beast, this animal," said the voice, bitterly. Startled again by the tone and accent, no less than by the words, she burst out. "Ah, why do you say that? But you do not know, and I cannot tell you. Yes, you are right, I am going away tomorrow. I am a courtesan. What then?" "By the gods, no!" he cried, and she heard him spring to his feet. Then, lowering his voice, "If I thought that, I would kill you." You would only forestall my own blow, she said quietly, and there was new silence. At last he spoke again. Tell me all of this matter. You are safe. I am a Roman. A Roman and a slave. And a slave. Tell me the truth quickly. The voice sounded weak and hollow now, but still strangely familiar. She began her story, speaking in a low monotone. I am Marcia, daughter of Titus Manlius Torquatus. I loved, and yet I drove my lover from me, and he was killed on the black day of Cannae. Then the Senate feared lest the enemy should advance to Rome, prayed for the winter, for time. And I was beautiful, and I had no love, save for the king Orcus. So the thought came to me that by my blandishments I might win power with these people, and by power delay, and by delay safety for Rome, and revenge for my lord Lucius. Therefore I journey to Capua. You see that I have played my part, that I have won. Tomorrow I go to pay the price. What matter it? Then I can die. He had listened in silence. Only she heard his breath coming hard, and a moment after she had finished, he spoke. No, you cannot die. Not thus. I have died once, yet I live. Listen, I, like the lover you tell of, was slain at Cannae, pierced through by javelins, and I lay with the dead heaped above me. Ah, so many hours, days, perhaps, I do not know, until the slave dealers passing among the corpses found me breathing and wondered at my strength, auguring a good value. Therefore they took me, and when I was well of my wounds, they brought me here, to Capua, and sold me to Pacuvius Calavius, to whom may the gods give the death of a traitor. Lo, now let it be for a warning that Orcus does indeed send back the dead from Acheron. He leaned forward as he spoke the words, and there came to Marcia a sudden memory of two occasions when she had used the ancient saying, the colloquial never of Rome. Once it had bound her to Idilcar, and once, far back, in happier times, it had parted her forever from Sergius. Tears rolled down her cheeks. A dim light seemed to be creeping into the room, very dim, but as her eyes grew dry again, she could begin to trace the outlines of her companion sitting on a low stool beside her couch. Surely those were footsteps in the hall. Yes, footsteps, and the approaching light of a lamp. Marcia's heart stood still. The slave had started from his seat and drawn far back in the darkest corner of the room. Then the curtains were pushed cautiously aside, and the tall form of Idilcar stood revealed by the light of the small silver lamp he bore in his hand. A long, dark mantle enveloped him from head to foot. Come, he said, speaking sharply but in low tones, and holding the lamp above his head, he tried to peer into the apartment. Come, it will soon be light. Ah, you have not risen. No matter. I have another cloak, and we must not delay. The slaves are well bribed, and Calavius sleeps soundly, forever. My horses, good horses, are in the street. A few moments, and we gain the gate. The Shalishism's own ring is on my finger, and the seal of the great council shall win us egress. You are my slave. That is how you shall go with me, and I accept the omen. He laughed low and harshly, and Marcia shuddered, thinking of her host lying slain, by his false slaves, by the order of Hannibal. No, rather by the hand or plotting of this wretch, who now called her slave. Come, come quickly, Romanus, he said, mimicking the Latin nomenclature of foreign slaves. At the same time, he took a step forward into the room and let the curtains fall behind him. Come, or I shall have to order the rods to those white shoulders. That would be— And then a shadow seemed to glide forward from the corner half behind him. For a moment a stream of lamplight fell upon a white, set face behind the Carthaginian's shoulder, a face that was indeed from the land of the 4 rivers. An arm was lashed round the priest's neck, and, while Marcia stared spellbound at the shade that had come back to save her, the lamp fell from Idilcar's hand, and then she lay still and listened to the furious struggle that ensued, the scuffling of feet upon the marble floor, the breathing that came and went in short, quick gasps. Now it seemed that both fell together, but not in victory or defeat, for the noises told of continuing combat. No words, only the horrible sound of writhing and of hard-drawn breath. Breaking at last from the bonds of dazed wonder, she glided from the couch, groping for the fallen lamp. She must see. She must know. Then she remembered the room lamp that stood on a stand by the bed, and began to feel her way toward it. The grating of metal against metal came to her ears, followed by a low exclamation and a sharp "Ah!" gasped exultantly. Then came the sound of two fierce blows. She had found the lamp now, and was trying to strike a light. The victory was still undecided, though the combatants seemed to groan with each breath they drew. At last the wick caught the spark, and the mellow light and the odor of perfumed oil began slowly to fill the room. A statuette or vase came crashing to the floor, and, raising the lamp high above her head, she threw its light upon the struggling men. For a moment she could make out nothing except a dark mass at her feet. Then she caught the glitter of a weapon, and at last her eyes grasped something of the situation. Idilcar was undermost. She could see his black, curling beard that seemed matted and ragged now, while the Roman, the man who bore the face of the dead Sergius, was extended upon him, grasping with both hands the Carthaginian's wrists. It was the latter who held the blade that had glittered, a long Numidian dagger, but the hold upon his wrists prevented his using it, and the Roman dared not release either hand to wrench it away. There were bruises, too, on Idilcar's face, the blows of fists, but the blood on the floor told of some other wound, doubtless the Roman's, inflicted before he could restrain the hand that had dealt it. Now, neither seemed able to accomplish further injury until the strength of one should fail, and if it was her protector's blood that was flowing, the thought was ominous. Neither dared to cry out, for the aid that might come was too doubtful, and, besides, they needed to husband all the air their lungs could gain. Marcia saw these things and thought them clearly, quickly, and in order. Her mind seemed to grow as strangely calm as if busied in selecting some shade of wool for her distaff. She reached down and by a quick movement twisted the dagger from the stiffened, weary fingers of the Carthaginian. A cry burst from him, the first since the triumphant "Ah!" that had doubtless come from his lips when he used the weapon. A few moments since he writhed furiously, and Marcia stood, holding the dagger in her hand, hesitating rather through dread of injuring this new Sergius that had arisen to aid her. The Roman, however, seeing himself freed from the necessity of guarding against the sharp point that had menaced him, now suddenly released the wrists of his adversary, and, grasping him by the throat, he lifted his head several times and struck it violently against the pavement. The Carthaginian groaned, and his hold relaxed for a moment. Then, tearing himself free, and with one hand still gripping the throat of the prostrate man, the Roman raised his body and, turning toward Marcia, reached out for the dagger. With eyes fixed wonderingly on his, she gave it to him, as if only half conscious of her act. Again the scene changed. Less helpless than he had seemed, and with staring eyes before which death danced, Idilcar gathered all his remaining strength for one last, despairing effort, wrenched himself loose, and staggered to his feet. Then Marcia saw Sergius, for she knew now it was indeed he, saw him throw himself forward on his knees, and, catching Idilcar about the hips, plunged the blade into his side. The priest shrieked once as he felt the point and struggled furiously to escape, raining blows upon the other's head and shoulders. Again the long dagger rose and fell, piercing the man's entrails. Gods! Would he never fall? And still he maintained his footing, but now his hands beat only the air, and his struggles became agonized writhings. Sergius' grip about his hips had never loosened, and the dagger rose and fell a third time. Idilcar groaned long and deeply and sank down in a heap, carrying his slayer with him. End of section number 26. Section 27 of The Lion's Brood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shashank Jakhmola. The Lion's Brood by Duffield OSBORNE. Flight. Slowly Sergius disengaged himself from the death grip that entangled him and, rising, turned to where Marcia stood. Still holding the lighted lamp above her head and peering forward, she gazed into his eyes with a look wherein wonder and terror were mingled with awakening joy. "Who are you?" she faltered at last. "You who come as a slave, bearing the face of a shade." "I am a shade," he answered, "once sent back by Orcus, by the hand of Mercury, to save a Roman woman from dishonor." "Oh, my Lord Lucius," she cried, falling upon her knees and holding out her hands toward him. "Truly it was not dishonor to avenge you, to save the Republic, but if it were, then may your manes pity and forgive me. There, now, is the dagger. Take it and use it, so that I, too, may be your companion when you return to the land that owns you. I love you, Lucius. The laughter of the old days has passed. Surely a woman who is about to die may say to the dead words which a girl might not say to her lover for the shame of them. I love you, I love you. Take me before the maiden, Proserpine, that she may show us favor to your land." The lamp fell from her hand. She felt herself raised suddenly from the pavement and strained hard against a bosom that rose and fell with all the pulsations of life and love. Frightened, wondering, she struggled faintly, while kisses warm and human fell upon her brow, her eyes, her lips. "Marcia, little bird, dearest, purest, best," murmured a voice close to her ear. "Yes, you shall go with me to my land, and that land is Rome." Still she trembled in his arms, not daring to believe. "Wait," he said. Then, releasing her for a moment, he regained the fallen lamp, relighted it, and placed it in its niche, facing her again with arms outspread. "Look well. Am I not indeed Lucius Sergius, once pierced and worn with wounds, but now well and strong to fight or love? The tale I told you was true. It was my tale, the saving of one Roman from the slaughter of her legions." She drew closer and looked again into his eyes. "Yes," she said, and in her voice the joy began to sweep away all other feelings. "Yes, you are indeed Lucius Sergius Fidenus, man, not shade." But, taking her hand, he interrupted. "Do you not remember the omen, my Marcia? How you said you would love me when Orcus should send back the dead from Akron? How I accepted it? How the gods have brought all about, as was most to their honor and my joy? For now you have indeed said that you love me." She placed her free hand upon his shoulders, saying, "And that which I, Marcia, daughter of Titus Manlius Torquatus, have said unto the shade, that say I to the living Lucius Sergius. Take me, love, for where thou art Caius, there shall I be Caia." Once again he took her in his arms and kissed her upon the lips, long and tenderly. Then she drew herself back. "You are wounded," she said anxiously. "Forgive me that I forgot. Truly I forget all things. Now, in this wonder and joy." Sergius laughed. "He pricked me in the thigh, I think, but not deeply. The gods have brought me so close to the shades that I am enough akin to them not to heed little hurts." But she had seized the lamp and was examining his injury, a flesh wound that, while it had bled freely, yet seemed to have avoided the larger muscles and blood vessels. "Did I not tell you?" he said reassuringly as she rose from her knee. "A close bandage so that it will not bleed, that is all we shall want, for my strength must remain with me yet a little while. if we would truly go to Rome and not to the realms of the dead. She said nothing, but, tearing strips from her stole, proceeded deftly to bind them around the leg. Agathocles himself could not do better, nay, I doubt Aesculapius, but she rose again quickly and placed her finger upon his lips. It is the gods who have saved us to each other. Do not make them angry, lest they withdraw their favor. I am ready to follow you, my lord Lucius. Standing erect, he raised both hands in invocation. A shrine to Venus the Preserver, to Apollo the Healer. Then, stooping quickly, he drew the long dark robe of Idilcar from where it lay entangled about the legs of the corpse. Fortunately, it had slipped down the Carthaginian's shoulders early in the struggle. Perhaps he had tried to free himself from it. Perhaps it had been partly torn away. But, in either event, it had fallen where it must have hampered his movements even more seriously, and where it was less stained with his blood than might have been expected. Sergius threw it over his own tattered, blood-stained garments, striving to hide the rents, and raising it high about his neck so as to conceal his face as much as possible. Meanwhile, Marcia, having bound on her sandals, had of her own accord donned the mantle Idilcar had brought for her, and which had fallen by the door of the apartment. Then, gathering up her long, thick hair, she confined it close above her head, drawing down upon it the hat that lay beside the cloak, a broad-brimmed Greek petasus, admirably adapted for concealment as well as protection. "I am ready," she said eagerly. "Let us make haste." Sergius was stooping over the dead man, searching for something. "It is the ring," he said, "the ring with the seal of the great council of which he spoke. How else should we pass the guard at the gate?" A moment later he rose, and going to the light, examined carefully the several rings taken from the priest's fingers. One by one they dropped and rolled away over the floor. The last only remained, and Marcia, looking over his shoulder, saw a heavy, gold signet bearing the device of a horse under a palm tree. "Come now," he said, taking her hand. He had thrust the long knife of Idilcar into the girdle of his tunic, and this was their only weapon. So, leading Marcia, he quickly traversed the halls and courts and gained the door, which hung ajar and unattended. Outside, a company of 5 men were gathered, all mounted. 2 were apparently soldiers, a sort of guard. The rest were servants. Heavy-looking packages were bound behind them on their horses' backs, doubtless the money which Idilcar had gotten, while 2 extra animals, saddled and bridled, were held in waiting. The heart of Sergius leaped as he noted the fine, small heads and slender muscular legs that marked the ancient stock of their mounts. Idilcar had provided well for all emergencies, but Sergius felt some anxiety lest a chance glimpse of his face might lead to detection. The sky in the east was already beginning to lighten, and there were more men of the escort than he had anticipated. Speech would be fatal. Therefore he strode quickly out, took the bridle of one of the horses from the man who held it, and swung himself upon its back. To assist Marcia could not be done without exciting suspicion, and he ground his teeth when she tried to follow his example, and one of the servants laughed and pushed her roughly into the saddle. Then they rode on, and the others followed, whispering together. He had muffled his face a trifle too closely, perhaps, and he had mounted the horse standing, whereas all knew that the Cappadocians were trained to kneel at the word. Therefore the men of the escort wondered, though they hardly ventured to suspect. Marcia felt, rather than noted, their attitude, and Sergius, glancing toward her, saw that she was trembling. He urged his horse faster toward the gate that opened upon the Appian Way. Boldness and speed were all that could save them. Suddenly the gate loomed up, grey and massive, in the mist of the early morning. Several soldiers lounged forward from the guardhouse, whence came the rattle of dice and the shrill laughter of a woman. Sergius showed his ring and said nothing, while Marcia came close to him, shivering, for the morning air was chill and biting. Their followers had drawn rein and were gathered in a little clump several spear lengths behind. Meanwhile the soldiers, Spaniards they seemed, were gazing stupidly at the device on the seal and making irrelevant comments. It was evident that their night had been spent among the wineskins and that a new danger menaced. Summoning what Punic he knew, Sergius leaned forward and asked in a low but stern voice to see their officer. Fortunately, his own followers were too far away to hear his words, and drunken Iberians would not be critical as to a faulty Punic accent. Still they hesitated, chattered together, and stared, but at last one who seemed more sober than the rest reeled away to the guard-house and, after some delay and evident persuasion, emerged again with a young officer whose moist, hanging lips and filmy eyes showed that he, too, had been dragged from the pursuit of pleasure. Helmetless and with loosened corselet, every detail of his appearance told the story of relaxed discipline. "What do you want at this hour?" he said thickly, ambling forward and leaning heavily upon the shoulder of his scarcely more steady guide. Again Sergius held out the ring, and the man, being a native Carthaginian, recognized it through the mist of his intoxication, and, throwing himself at full length, touched the earth with his forehead. "What do you wish?" he said, rising and standing, somewhat sobered by the presence of such authority. "Open the gate. I ride under orders of Shalishism," said the Roman, again speaking low and rapidly. The officer turned and shouted to his men, and several ran to unbar the gate with such speed as the condition warranted. The other occupants of the guard-house were now grouped at door, 5 men, half-armed, and 2 dishevelled women with painted faces and flower-embroidered palace. The gate swung slowly on its hinges. "The light of the balls be with you, friend," exclaimed Sergius, and he and Marcia rode through with hearts beating madly. Voices raised in discussion made them turn in their saddles. In his drunken stupidity, the Carthaginian officer was trying to detain their escort and servants. The master had said nothing about them. How did he know they belonged to the same party? Then all began gesticulating and shouting to Sergius for help and explanation. Here was an unforeseen incident, and the mind of the young Roman viewed it rapidly in all its lights. On the one side, he would be relieved of an awkward following that might at any moment begin to suspect him. On the other hand, to leave these in the lurch would be to invite prompt suspicion. Still, they were 50 yards or more in advance. Their horses were good, and more space would be gained before the tangle at the gate could be straightened out. Therefore he waved his arm as if making some signal, and turning again in his saddle, rode on, but without increasing his speed. Louder shouts followed him, for, as he had intended, his gesture had proved unintelligible. Then, when they saw he did not stop, the cries ceased suddenly, and an animated chattering came to his ears. Here was suspicion trying to make itself understood, and, at last, succeeding, for, as Sergius glanced back once more to note how the matter progressed, the young captain of the gate sprang forward and shouted for him to halt. "A third altar, to Mercury the Hastener!" exclaimed Sergius. "Quick now, with the knees!" And, pressing the flanks of his Cappadocian, both animals bounded forward into a headlong gallop. End of section number 27. Section 28 of The Lion's Brood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shashank Jakhmola. The Lion's Brood by Duffield OSBORNE. Winter Quarters. The beat of hoofs upon the great blocks of basalt rang through the morning air in measured cadence, and soon an answering echo came up from the south. Open flight had at last dispelled all doubt and given the signal for pursuit. First came the 2 Africans of the original escort, released and bidden to ride for life or death. A short distance behind was the Carthaginian captain on his own horse, which had probably been haltered behind the guard-house. And, last of all, 3 of the Spanish guard, who had thrown the servants and baggage from the animals that bore them and appropriated such speed as these afforded for the business in hand. That the officer was pretty well sobered seemed apparent. A fugitive bearing the ring of Salis, the seal of the Great Council, must be a man of importance, or else the possession of such a talisman augured the commission of some terrible crime. Already he saw himself stretched, writhing upon the cross, the crowd, reviling or gibing, seeming surging about his feet, and his howls of anguish found voice in a storm of guttural objurgations to men and horses, mingled with prayers and vows to the gods of Carthage. He had overtaken the 2 Africans now, for his animal was better than this, but the 3 others labored hopelessly behind. The Cappadocians flew rather than galloped far in advance. Already nearly 300 yards separated them from their pursuers, and the gap was widening slowly but surely. Only the officer held his own, for he was now forging ahead of the Africans. "Ah, cowards! Slime! Filth!" he shouted to his struggling men. The cross! That for you unless we catch them, that for me, for all. Ah, Eshmaun! Ah, Kamon, Melkart, gift, golds, gems, robes, spices, my firstborn to the bells, help, speed!" The man was mad indeed, with terror and newly dispelled drunkenness, and his horse, a great African, coal-black save for one white hoof, seemed to partake of his master's frenzy. With ears lying flat along his head, and eyes that burnt into those of Sergius when he ventured to glance behind him, glaring sheer through distance and dust like the very eyes of those demons his rider invoked, the beast thundered on, equaling the speed of the light Asiatic chargers by the force of strength alone. From time to time the fugitives turned their heads to measure the distance, and the sight of this unwearied pursuer appeared to fascinate them as by some weird power. The rest were beaten out, the Spaniards lost to sight, the Africans visible only by the dust that hung over them far behind. The mountains to the eastward seemed to be dancing away in a mad chase toward the south, a chase which Tifata itself was urging on. The glimmer of white in the north told of the morning sun striking upon houses. Still they rode on, pursuers and pursued. Suddenly a sound, half trumpet note, half bellow, swelled up ahead. Then another answered it, and another took up the refrain. Sergius' face blanched, and, with a sudden effort, he threw his animal almost upon its haunches. Marcia was carried several spear lengths farther before she could check her speed. Wonder and the dread of some accident drove the blood to her heart. A hoarse shout of triumph came from the pursuer as she turned to ride back. She asked no questions. Surely Sergius knew what was best. She saw Idilkar's long dagger in his hand, and that he was about to fight. Back, and to one side," he called as she rode up. "Did you not hear the elephants? That is Castellinum, and they are besieging it. We should have remembered." He darted forward to meet the Carthaginian, fearful that he, too, would draw rein and await the coming of his followers. Then indeed all would be lost. 6 soldiers on the one side and a campful on the other were hopeless odds against a wounded man armed only with a Numidian dagger. But it was Bacchus that fought for Rome that day, Bacchus to whom no altar had been vowed. A night of debauchery and the sudden terror of its awakening had effectually blurred whatever judgment the officer may have had, and his one thought was to kill or capture his quarry. So they came together, Sergius swerving his Cappadocian as they met. The officer struck blindly, but the good Lord Bacchus put out his hand and turned the blow aside. Then, as they parted, a strange thing happened. Marcia had wondered dimly why Sergius struggled with the long, girdleless garment of Idilkar, tearing it off as he rode. Now, when the 2 horses sprang apart, she saw that he had thrown it dexterously over the Carthaginian, blinding his blow and tangling him in its heavy folds. Prompt to respond to knee and rein, the Cappadocian wheeled almost as soon as he ran clear, but the African thundered on while its rider cursed in blind terror and tried to check his horse and to free his face and sword arm. A moment, and he had succeeded, but he succeeded too late. The Roman was at his back, and Marcia saw the long dagger rise and fall in a swift thrust. She could not see how the point took its victim just at the nape, but she saw him pitch forward like an ox under the axe. Almost before she could grasp what had happened, Sergius was beside the fallen man, had resumed the priest's tunic, red with new bloodstains, and was on his horse again. His brow lay in deep lines as he rode toward her. "Come," he said, "the gods favoring us. We must pass their camp before the rest come up. Grant that those may linger by the corpse, and that we meet no check." Again they were galloping toward the lines that lay about Casilinum. All had happened so quickly that even now they could scarcely see the plume in the distant dust cloud that told where the pursuers straggled on. They had turned into the new side road without meeting a man. Then a small foraging party halted them, and Sergius showed the seal and spoke in Gallic to its Numidian leader. A little farther on was stationed another band, and here the delay was longer ere his halting Punic convinced the Spanish piquet, and they again rode forward unsuspected. All had bowed low to the horse and the palm tree, and no one dared question what weighty mission urged on the man in the torn and blood-stained tunic and the slender youth, his companion. Now they were back again upon the pavement of the Appian. The last line was passed, and the beleaguered town with its stout-hearted garrison lay well behind. Perhaps that sudden uproar told of the arrival of the pursuers. Perhaps those glittering points amid distant dust clouds meant a new pursuit. Surely none but Mercury had winged the feet of the Cappadocians. Unwearied, like springs of steel, the stout muscles drove them on over the marshland with the glint of the sea before them, on, up the rising ground. Again and again Sergius turned in his saddle, scanning the road behind, feeling the presence of pursuers whom he could not see. The good horses were weakening fast. No flesh and blood could stand that strain, and naught but the spirit of the breed kept them afoot. Marcia was limping painfully. The one Sergius rode was wavering in its stride, like the Carthaginian captain when he came out of the guardhouse by the gate. Gods, what were those shrill sounds, half whistle, half scream? Too well he remembered how the Numidians urged on their bridleless chargers. Yes, there they were now, scarce, half a milestone behind, and coming up like the wind that blew through their dishevelled manes, 50 at least. Death, then, was decreed, after all, and he glanced toward Marcia, measuring the time when he might kiss her and kill her ere he sold his own life to the javelins. Suddenly he heard her cry out. "Look!" she called, and following her finger he gazed eagerly ahead. A clump of horsemen, heavy-armed with helmet and corselet, crowned the knoll of rising ground over which the road led, and, above them, fluttering in the breeze, he saw the square vexillium of the cavalry of the legion. He was among them now, lifting Marcia from her horse, and dimly conscious of many words being spoken around. "See, Lord, they have halted," said a voice. "Is it your will that we pursue?" Then, as an answering voice replied in the negative, he kissed Marcia and made her drink wine that someone brought. Barbarous cries that she must not hear or understand came to his ears, and he knew that their pursuers were wheeling in discomfited flight. The circle of soldiers stood back. Something cold and feathery fell upon his upturned face and turned to moisture. He saw a tall man with features of wonderful beauty regarding them kindly and in silence. His white paludamentum was heavily fringed with purple, and Sergius recognized him now. Marcus Marcellus, the new dictator. Another drop, feathery, cold, and moist, fell upon Marcia's hand, and she roused herself at the touch, peering up into her lover's face, and then quickly at the heavens. "Look," she cried, "up, not into my eyes." He turned for an instant to see the blue vault of a few moments since overcast with grey and filled with a swirl of snowy flakes. "See, now, Lucius, lord of my life, here are the messengers of winter. Winter quarters. He is in winter quarters. See, have we not prevailed?" It was the voice of the dictator that answered, "Yes, truly, and there shall soon be prepared for him eternal summer quarters in Phlegethon, if the Greek tales be true." End of section number 28. End of The Lion's Brood by Duffield OSBORNE.